Thank you so much. I'm going to go on and keep us on schedule. So, Dr. Lection, if you will hold your question, we will look forward to you bringing it up again later. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Rita Redberg from the University of California, San Francisco. Sorry about that. Please, welcome.
Thanks very much. And I really enjoyed Dr. Sa's talk, and will comment. I used to, on my long commute to work, listen to various professional like audio tapes where basically were summaries of the scientific sessions, and you had to do your disclosures first, and people would say their disclosures and then always say, but these had no influence on my research. I mean, I actually stopped listening because I thought they did have a lot of influence on the research, and I wasn't, because there was so much difference between what was found and what was being said. But I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, I take money and it influences what I think. I don't know if anyone here has, but we can talk about that later. But that does provide a good lead into my talk, which I will share my screen now, is on the role of the sponsor or funder in research studies. Let me just get this started. Oh, sorry. And well, I'll do my introduction while I'm trying to share my screen. I'm a professor of medicine and a cardiologist at UCSF. And I'm also the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine. And I think you can see it now, right? And my funding is for my research from Arnold Ventures, as well as from the National Institutes of Health. And my comments today are as an individual. I'm not speaking for policies of the JAMA network. So I wanted to just talk a little bit more about what we have been having great discussions about for the last 3 days, is what is the impact of these conflicts of interest, and in particular, things that I think raise concern for the objectivity and therefore the reliability of the science that's actually published, and that helps to guide our professional practice, our guidelines, and choices for how we take care of patients. And so a few things, that I think raise particular concern, besides, as I said, I stopped listening to those audio tapes, but I think we all are guided by peer review. I have the greatest respect for medical journals, of course, in peer review, but there are warning signs to me that I think we need to think about as a profession, and what would be best practices. And those are in particular when there is, to me, evidence of influence in the research articles from the sponsor, and lines that raise concern are things that where it shows the role of the sponsor. So as we talked about, a lot of research is industry funded, and that's okay as long as that is the academic investigators remain independent of industry funding. So it's a hands-off kind of grant in my best view. But often what I instead will see is lines like the sponsor perhaps chose the sites, which, I mean, all of these are places, as we know, where sponsors can have influence. It could be sites where the people are particularly warm to the particular drug or device being studied, or particularly interested, or are already have relationships. The sponsor can adjudicate the endpoints. Often the endpoints in studies are not hard endpoints, which is basically death. All other endpoints are adjudicated. Certainly in my field, heart attacks is no longer a black and white diagnosis, but there's all shades of gray. Same for strokes. And so it really makes a difference who is adjudicating the endpoint and how objective and blinded they are. Did the sponsor participate in the writing of the paper? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Or did the sponsor review the final product or have sign off on the final product? And here are just some examples. This was a paper published a few years ago. I will note that this paper was on a particular cardiac device, a transcatheter mitral valve. There had previously been a number of papers, 5 or 6, published on this valve. All of them showed negative, that this valve was not of any benefit to patients. This trial was sponsored by the company, Abbott, who makes the valve. And this trial was positive. And so, of course, I read this with interest to see what was different about this study than all the previous non-industry funded studies. And this is what I found. The protocol, which was available at New England Journal, where this was published, had been designed by the principal investigators in conjunction with the sponsor. That sponsor participated in site selection and management. The sponsor participated in data analysis. Not only that, the authors had significant financial relationships with the sponsor. This is just an example of the first, the second, and the third, as well as the senior author. All of these authors had financial conflict directly related to the sponsor. I will say, shortly after this trial was published, yet another trial, a French trial, was published that, again, found no benefit for this device. So this remained the only trial that found a benefit for the device. The device got FDA approval and is in current practice. And it seemed to be all based on this one trial where, it seemed to me, sponsor had a lot of influence, and perhaps related or perhaps not, this was a positive trial for the device, but I think certainly raises a lot of concern for objectivity. Another example, again, like cardiac devices. So this was another cardiac device, and it was a different company. But again, we see the same study was designed by the sponsor. Sponsor participated in selection and management. Sponsor participated in data analysis. And sponsor participated in writing. And so, and again, there were financial conflicts between the authors and the sponsor. And so I think we should be thinking about and discussing what are the concerns for objectivity when there's such a close relationship between the sponsor and the actual study being done. Another point, or things to me that raise concern for looking for influence and objectivity and funding sources and their influence, is looking at the outcomes of the study. As I said, a lot of outcomes are now what we call soft outcomes. There's a lot of preference, particularly among industry sponsors, for using composite outcomes with soft endpoints. And all of this is to basically make the trials faster and cheaper, because the bigger your event rate is, the shorter your trial can be and the smaller your trial can be. And event rates for rarely occurring but clinically significant events, like in cardiology, often heart attacks and death, are a lot lower than they are for things like hospitalization or occurrence of some kind of symptom that is a very subjective symptom. Yet what I see frequently is composite endpoints, and of course they're driven by these very weak soft endpoints, and it's particularly a concern in non-blinded trials. Another example is, are the conclusions consistent with the results? Like when the results are negative, but the conclusions say this is a promising new therapy, I always looked for the line about what is the sponsor's role and what was the relationship with the authors. Another example, again recently, and this is from a letter that I wrote with some colleagues. It was not published, but I'm sharing it because it was about an article again about this another cardiac device. This one is a what's called cerebral embolic protection device. It's basically like a mesh that's put in the aorta after this transcatheter aortic valve, which is a percutaneous aortic valve replacement. The actual aortic valve gets crushed, so calcium goes flying, and strokes happen. And so this was an experiment to see if it would reduce the stroke rate. And the actual stroke rate, as you can see, was not different. The device is called CEP, cerebral embolic protection. It was essentially the same, 2.3% in the group that got the device, 2.9% that in the other group, with a 95% confidence interval from minus 1.7 to 0.5 and a statistically insignificant result. However, in the published paper in the New England Journal, the authors concluded, on the basis of the confidence interval around this outcome, the results may not rule out a benefit of cerebral embolic protection during TAVR. However, the reason we wrote a letter and we were concerned is because they made no mention of the fact that it also did not rule out a harm during TAVR, and that the author's choice to include only the benefit fails to acknowledge the harm, and it also fails to acknowledge that all of the previous studies of the same device again had shown no benefit. This study was sponsored by the company that made it. This was a different company, Boston Scientific. And that our concern is that by emphasizing benefit over harm, there's a risk of misleading clinicians and encouraging use of a device that adds cost and risk without possible benefit. And frankly, I've never seen a conclusion in a published article where the study clearly the confidence intervals included one, and one could not conclude benefit or harm, and yet the conclusion was allowed to say the results may not rule out a benefit. And I find this concerning and certainly concerning for sponsor influence and conflicts of interest. And this is an example. I don't know how many, I'm sure some of you remember this from almost 25 years ago now, but I'm afraid we haven't made enough progress past it. This was coverage in the Wall Street Journal by Ralph King, how a drug firm paid for a study by a university, then yanked it. And actually, this was what occurred at UCSF, where one of the researchers from the School of Pharmacy, and maybe Lisa can tell us more about this story, but she did a study funded by Boots Pharmaceutical, which made Synthroid to see whether generic drugs were equivalent to the branded drug. And as you know, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of feelings over whether generic drugs are equivalent to branded drugs. Her findings were this drug was equivalent, and she was prevented by the sponsor, by Boots Pharmaceuticals, from publishing this article. It was about to go to press, I believe, in JAMA, and then was yanked because her agreement with Boots said that they had final say over the publishing and writing of the manuscript. I will say, and we can, since then, the University of California, I'm pleased to say, has banned contracts that allow funder control of publication, but this is not a universal policy across all academic institutions. And so I think, for high quality industry or in any sponsor funded research, you have to have a group of independent, qualified academic investigators. And I think when you do have that, you do not need the help of the sponsor to put together the trial, to help choose the sites, to help adjudicate the endpoints, to do the data analysis, to write up the results, because all of that means that there's influence of the results. So I think the things I wanted to sort of raise and talk about today are, should journals, or as a profession or as other groups, should we consider restricting the role of the sponsor in submitted papers? And the example I'm thinking of is, didn't mean to do that. There had been a requirement, as people I'm sure remember, for clinical trial registration for many years that frankly was often ignored. And when it became, and I think Kathy DeAngelis from JAMA about 15 years ago or so said, well, and with support of the ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, that articles that did not have clinical registration could not be published in top medical journals. Then we started seeing a big change, and trials did start getting registered, so that protocols were registered prior to the initiation of the trial. And I think having a similar kind of requirement for journals in terms of data integrity and objectivity of data and absence of sponsor influence would have similar effects. There used to be, but is no longer, a policy at JAMA that any paper that was had data analysis done by the sponsor had to also have an independent statistical analysis. And I would be interested in approaches like that. And I also think, as we've been talking about for the last few days, that having data sharing. So currently there is a requirement to have a data sharing statement, but most of those data sharing statements, particularly for industry funded studies, say we're not sharing our data. So I think actually having data publicly available so that independent researchers could analyze the same data set would certainly help to improve the objectivity of the science. And I think our mutual goal is that investigators should be independent of the sponsor in all aspects of study design, data analysis, and writing. I would be interested in sort of what is the most, assuming people agree, most reasonable ways to sort of move forward and implement this. And I think we do have time for a discussion of this. So I'm interested in hearing other thoughts, but I, as I said, just am increasingly concerned about the lack of objectivity in scientific writings, and don't want the standards for high quality science, and particularly for publications, to fall, because this is what we rely on for patient care. So thanks very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We do have time for some questions here. We did have one question come in at the end of the last question period. Oh, Dr. Lection, your choice. You're first. You go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is related to what Dr. Redberg had to say. First of all, just a quick anecdote or a quick story that with respect to the conflict of interest disclosures in talks, and somebody actually timed how long slides were up at conferences where there were oral presentations, and the average length of time that a slide was shown was 2 seconds, which really doesn't allow anybody even to read the slide, let alone to understand what the conflict implications might be. The second point that I'd just like to make is around the Synthroid story, which is that at the time that the article was going to come out, Boots was in the process of being bought out by another company. And the understanding is that one of the motivations for what Boots did is that if the study came out before the sale went through, that the value of the company would drop significantly. And Boots did not want to see that because it would affect shareholder value. And I think that this is this idea about studies coming out is being seen when we look at terminations of clinical trials before they're done on commercial grounds. So not because the drug is being shown to be unsafe or because it's really good and it's unethical to continue, but simply because often because of mergers, the companies decide that that particular area of research is no longer going to be profitable or is not the direction that they want to go. So they terminate the studies before they're completed, before they have meaningful results. And so everybody involved, the researchers and the patients, essentially have wasted their time.
The Synthroid case is complicated on so many levels because my understanding is that she actually signed the contract personally and it hadn't gone through the university. It is admirable for the university to ban that, and good practice at universities is indeed to do that and to be careful. Dr. Barrow.
Rita, thank you for those really incredible examples of how the studies on the devices can be manipulated. And I think that, we've mentioned over the last couple of days that sometimes you can't do meta-research studies on drugs because there's really no non-industry funded comparison group. But I think when you're talking devices, you're really in that situation most of the time. And so we might have more time on this in the solution section, but I'm wondering, what do you think are some possible ways to manage funding in an area where almost all of it is coming from the makers of the products?
Thanks, Lisa. And I will say, Lisa and I and Sanket, I think, first started looking at devices and this issue 15 years ago, and it really opened my eyes to what I think remains the Wild West of standards for quality of evidence for device approvals. And I think that's still really where we have to start. And I do think the FDA has to strengthen their standards. And I think, unfortunately, the FDA has been moving for many reasons, like the medical device, the dependence on user fees and others, to lowering their standards. And, the Cures Act that was passed in the Obama administration at the end of 2016 basically said, it was, you say cures, it was like snake oil, like let's get devices onto the market quicker, who needs to wait for studies? But I think that mandating rigorous standards, that there actually have to be meaningful clinical endpoints and randomized control studies with placebos, which we found happen very rarely. As you know, in the JAMA paper we published in 2009, has to be an FDA standard, has to be a professional standard, and has to be embraced as well by medical journals. As I was talking today is, because I thought it worked well for clinical trial registration, whether having requirements for publications that emphasize the objectivity of the study would be effective, but there would have to be support of the professions and the medical journals in order to do that. And I'm interested in whether you think that's viable, whether there are other solutions going forward. Certainly, I think Sunita talked to us about professionalism, and that's important. But when it's voluntary, it's not that effective always.
Thank you both so much.